In Canada, it seems that there's a lot of issues that most Canadians don't even know exist. We see a lot of American proms blown out all over the media, in-depth discussion of their economic and social issues. However, there seems to be little to no discussion about Canadian proms. Canada is an amazing country, sitting somewhere between Europe and the US in terms of social policies, laws, and attitudes towards different political issues. However, there's one issue almost every country in the Western world had to learn the hard way. Expensive houses aren't good for a country. If you've been sleeping under a rock lately and haven't seen the news, Canada is undergoing an explosive housing bubble where prices are rising 33% in some areas. Time and time again, we see it plastered all over the news, especially in Vancouver, where the average detached house has hit nearly 1.5 million, depending on when you see this video. Depending on who you ask, rising house prices are either good or bad, but at this point, it's downright dangerous, as we don't need to argue or discuss the merits of a high selling price on a condo to figure out exactly what will happen in the next few years. We can just look at the US and Europe, where prices spiked back in 2009. Speculative investing and risky and shady loan practices pushed many people into mortgages they couldn't afford. People believed that prices would only go up, and therefore almost anyone could qualify for a mortgage, even at rates higher than today. When all was said and done, this echoed much of the pain felt in Japan in the infamous real estate crash of 1990, where even in Tokyo, a city with 30 million inhabitants in a single enormous metropolis, prices still crashed and many lost their life savings. Having said this, how is this allowed to happen in Canada? Haven't we learned from other countries? Well, the problem is free market economics is dependent on humans with their flawed logic and emotions clouding our every judgment. We buy when others buy, and we sell when others sell. We like to think we're intelligent, but realistically, we're social creatures who tend to follow social norms and buy into hype, jump in when others are jumping in, and leave when others are leaving. To go against this goes against every part of our genetic programming. However, these are all subjective factors that can't be quantified or measured, especially in the time span of this video. But there are objective and concrete ways governments and also societies influence their economies through taxes, various policies, and most of all, interest rates. We're going to take a deep look into exactly how these factors taken together caused and formed the biggest and longest running housing bubble in Canadian history. First, in Canada, we have what's called an immigrant investor program, which allows anyone with a net worth of at least $1.6 million to enter Canada by entering and investing in Canadian bonds. In order to qualify for this visa, you must pay $800,000 into a government fund for 5 years, which is used to pay for infrastructure and government projects, which upon it is returned back to you within 5 years. This indirectly means we currently have hundreds of thousands of deep-pocketed immigrants flooding into Canada, not only outbuying local Canadians, but even other immigrants. It's very difficult to compete with a cash buyer who doesn't need to wait around for a loan approval or any form of paperwork. Not only this, they are more likely to earn this money in a lower tax bracket and a less regulated environment. Whereas you, as the average Canadian, must pay income taxes, sales tax, pay into CPP, EI, and various other obligations before any of that income can be used to pay down a mortgage. This puts the average Canadian at a huge disadvantage for qualifying for mortgages, but also being able to buy or bid for a house. Now, this doesn't mean inherently that every single person coming on this immigrant investor visa is buying houses left, right, and center. It's more of a consequence of where the cash is coming from. And yes, it's from mainland China. This isn't going to be some anti-immigrant or anti-Chinese field rhetoric, but simply the truth is, China's economy is exploding, with more millionaires in the US and an extremely ultra version of their very own housing bubble, along with the lingering communism and all, and their totalitarian Communist Party. If you're a rich person in this country, let's face it, would you want your wealth still in that country? Another elephant in the room is, a lot of this money is coming from less than legitimate sources. Estimates put Chinese official corruption at $86 billion a year, and in China, corruption can carry the death penalty. Even for citizens who made their fortune legitimately, there's lots of concerns about keeping your wealth and cash under a government which can at any time seize your money, throw you in jail, or even outright put you to death for almost any crime imaginable. A mainstay of Chinese culture is that they just so happen to trust and prefer physical real estate than to stock portfolios or other investment vehicles. This means billions are coming to Canada and buying up houses left, right, and center. This has nothing to do with Canadians or interest rates or even housing demand, but rather is an intensifier for an already local problem. Now let's focus on the local issues at hand that are adding to this housing bubble. As a Canadian who's born to immigrant parents, I am not against immigration whatsoever. However, facts are facts, and ignoring these to be politically correct is very incorrect. We currently have about 300,000 new immigrants entering Canada every single year. This is basically the entire population of Markham or Vaughan, Ontario, every single year. This doesn't include the most infamous form of immigration, temporary foreign workers, or TFWs for short. This literally means we need to find an entire city's worth of infrastructure, houses, roads, schools, and hospitals just to accommodate all the people that are coming into Canada every single year. You don't need to be an economist to understand what this will do to a country's housing market. As well, in Canada, we have our own version of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If you know what these companies were, they were government institutions that helped to take on a lot of the loan risk for mortgages that caused a lot of the financial crisis in the US. Here, it's called the CMHC, or the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which moves a lot of the risk for these mortgages from the banks to the government in a sort of moral hazard, where banks are able to loan out mortgages with little to no risk from insurance from the CMHC, backed by the taxpayer. This exactly mirrors a lot of the factors that caused the US housing bubble in 2009. The second factor adding to this housing bubble is interest rates. With the help of the Canadian government keeping rates artificially low for extended periods of time, mortgages and loans have never been cheaper. With the US economy bustling and the Federal Reserve raising rates for the first time in years, this is raising market prices for interest rates and mortgages, whether the Bank of Canada raises rates or not. As we saw, Stephen Pullos has been making any excuse not to raise rates to the detriment of the prices that we pay at the pump and at the grocery store. This not only keeps interest rates artificially low, but it also raises and pumps even more money into the housing market, as buyers can put up even more money for the same house on the same income, allowing the seller to collect even more and in turn move up to a bigger house, spend more on their future house, or spend the money into the economy, causing a sort of nuclear chain reaction where money is flooding the economy, wherein prices must rise to keep pace with the level of money in the economy. This is also known as inflation. We can already see this with gas prices hitting $1.20 while oil is still in its 50s. And most of all, rising home prices get people elected, and also it keeps them in power. Anybody who isn't educated in finance or business can easily fall into the lullaby that they can get rich and earn financial success just by living in a house. The house is the only consumption item that people commonly think as an investment. Don't get me wrong, a home can be an investment, for example renting or leasing. However, if you're living in it, it's simply just a living expense, as houses carry lots of costs such as property tax, repairs, maintenance, the mortgage, not to mention the opportunity costs lost from having hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up in a house which could be invested in the market for return. The only time a house is considered an investment is only to the bank when you're paying for 30 years of interest on your mortgage. So if you're running for political office and you had house prices skyrocket in the past few years, you can expect a long, lengthy stay in office, as we saw recently with Stephen Harper. Now, there still will be some viewers of this video who won't see this as a problem. Well, for one, this not only creates huge imbalances between classes of society, but also generational, as many well-paid and highly employed older individuals nearing retirement sell off in the market after long careers making high salaries, also take and run with large sums of money in house appreciation, leaving younger generations to buy into the housing market under huge amounts of debt, lingering student loans, and lower pay for the same jobs that their parents did a generation ago. This combines for a huge problem down the road as retirement and healthcare costs explode and put even more burden on people trying to enter the housing market and bring thousands of whether rich or unrich immigrants, only to inflame this issue, as most immigrants without wealth will only flood the rental market and rich immigrants will simply outbuy their local Canadian counterparts. In short, expensive housing makes not only a city but a country uncompetitive, as companies have a hard time recruiting talented individuals into a city where real estate prices have exploded. People employed in cities like Vancouver or Toronto will require ever higher salaries just to sustain their cost of living. This is not only reflective in employee costs but also turnover, as people who make even $70,000 in cities like Vancouver will easily see living standards drop below someone who's making $30,000 in a city like Regina or Winnipeg. Rising real estate also indirectly makes commercial real estate expensive, reducing the competitiveness of producing goods or services in that country. And companies that don't need to locate inside of a country in order to do business in that country will simply move their factories or offices somewhere else. This is evident with the fleeing manufacturing base leaving Ontario in droves, and even with the employee and staffing problems in Vancouver, as young and talented people outright refuse job offers simply because the cost of living there is too high. All of this has pushed mortgage debt carried by Canadians to incomprehensible levels. Mortgage debt in Canada has hit $2.02 trillion in March 2017. Just to put this in perspective, the entire value of our entire GDP is just 1.6 trillion. This isn't economic stability, it's downright dangerous. When debt levels are skyrocketing with the price of housing, this isn't a sign of a strong economy or higher incomes. Rather, it's a dangerous game of financial hot potato. As more and more Canadians go into life-crippling debt, and we as Canadians bask in the temporary economic benefit of doling out billions in loans, flooding the economy at the cost of future generations and the very concept of what it means to be Canadian. As thousands of talented and well-educated young Canadians leave the country frustrated with the economic conditions in Canada, all while we bring in hundreds of thousands of people wishing them a better life, only to experience a new set of problems than the ones they left their home country for, and pushing new generations into more and more precarious economic conditions simply to live a life anywhere near the same level as their parents.